Welcome to the Melbourne School of Government in this strangely designed room, but I'm glad that no one's tripped as they came down, so congratulations for navigating the stairs well. Welcome to this address on assessment of the national budget. I want to begin, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay respects to their elders past and present and to their families. My name's John Langmore. I'm one of the Assistant Directors for Research in the School of Government. This meeting is obviously one that the School of Government ought to be sponsoring, but as well as that, we decided to do it because we're exploring a research project on ageing and fiscal policy, and of course the budget has quite a lot to do with that. Before starting, I'm told that I should let you know that one of these slides will tell you, if I can find it. We'll tell you how you can tweet about this meeting. There you are. Somebody in the School of Government is very keen on tweeting, so if you want to tweet after the meeting's over, that's the address to do it for. Now it's a great delight and privilege to introduce John. John is an Australian Laureate Fellow in Economics at the University of Queensland. He's previously held chairs in several universities, Australian National University, James Cook University, and been visiting professor at several others. He's prominent both as a research economist and as a commentator on Australian economic policy. He's a Fellow of the Econometric Society, the Academy of the Social Sciences of Australia, and several other learned societies and institutions. He has produced over 1,500 publications, and I can vouch for that being true because I went through the list of them, and it's a remarkable achievement of publication in many fields, including macroeconomic policy, decision theory, environmental economics, production economics, and the theory of economic growth. His latest book, Zombie Economics, How Dead Ideas Still Work Among Us, was first published by Princeton University Press and more recently by Black Ink in Australia. And very strikingly, it's already been translated into 8 languages. The Financial Times reviewer of Zombie Economics said that John is a writer of great verve who's marshalled some powerful evidence. Ross Gittins said, "I highly recommend it." One of the responders to his blog has called him Krugman of the Antipodes. Not all of you will know that Paul Krugman is perhaps one of the most admired economists in the United States, writing for twice a week for the New York Times. Another writes that he's a compassionate exponent of the dismal science. John will give an assessment of the budget, and then of course there'll be an opportunity for questions and comments, provided they're brief, and I'll be very severe about that. So it's a great delight and privilege to introduce John.
Thanks, John. Thanks for inviting me and come to Melbourne on a lovely day and had a nice time. And I should mention that among those publications, one of the ones I'm proudest of is my book Work for All with John, which was quite early on in my career, and I guess set a pattern for writing up policy prescriptions which have been ignored by governments ever since. I am, no, very much so. And I should say, I hope no one has come expecting a rundown of the budget measures and a list of who wins and who loses. You can find many excellent websites that do this, and I may indeed have to pass on specific questions because I've tried first on the basis that under current circumstances, the budget constitutes a wish list rather than a program that's going to be legislated into action. It's all going to be negotiated with some combination of Labor, the Greens, Mr Palmer and so forth. So what I want to do, I guess, is put this budget in its historical context and lead up to an assessment. Oh, the other thing I was going to mention, of course, is I'm perfectly happy for you to tweet during proceedings and engage in major tweetables among yourselves if you wish while I'm talking. But these things happen. So I think Australian incoming governments, particularly LNP governments, have followed a very familiar script for at least the past 25 years or so. That is, the government gets in on the basis of a bunch of reasonably attractive goodies and promises to do nothing nasty. Then it discovers to its horror that the outgoing government, particularly if it's a Labor government, has left the budget in a terrible mess, appoints a Commission of Audit, and the Commission of Audit recommends with regret that all of the promises need to be dumped and that we need to start again from scratch. I guess, although in some respects the Hawke government's discovery of this in 1983 was part of this pattern, the real innovator here, as in many other bad things in Australian public policy, was Nick Greiner, who set up the first Commission of Audit in 1988, headed by Charles Curran, who people with a long memory, quite a few people here might have a long memory, was the leading plaintiff or leading defendant in the Curran case, which was one of the bottom of the harbour tax scheme. So I think if you wanted somebody whose concern was to protect both sides of the budget, a prominent tax dodger would not be perhaps your first port of call. And of course, in 20 odd commissions of audit since then, I don't think there's been any recommendation that could have been said to do much for the revenue side, particularly if you exclude revenue measures that fall primarily on the poor. So we have this familiar script, budget crisis, Commission of Audit and so forth. My first observation is, of course, that this isn't true, that Australia is in a remarkably good position, and indeed, after listening to the government's denunciation of the mess that it's been left, to read Budget Paper 1 with its glowing comparisons of how the Australian economy performed over the last 5 years compared to virtually every other country in the world, you really wonder if the Treasurer delivering his speech had actually read his own document. It's, of course, entirely correct that Australia has performed much better than the rest of the OECD, but this was primarily due to the very policies the government's announcing, namely fiscal expansion, and that a mild sidelight on this is that if you then proceed to the international section, you will see that there's no mention at all of the 2 percentage point increase in growth that was the sole output of the G20 meeting in February. Indeed, the prediction is that international growth will remain depressed by policies of the very kind that this government has been advocating. And so my little plea would be, given that it's now clearly a total waste of time, that maybe Brisbane could be spared the G20 meeting and we could just skip on to Istanbul, which I think is the next stop in that process. So this piece of theatre, I think, has finally run its course. It certainly, whereas previously it could always count on good reviews, at least from some predictable sources, I think I haven't seen anybody, perhaps outside the Murdoch press, who's taken either the Commission of Audit or the general budget crisis seriously. Everybody's understood that all of this is meant as a piece of softening up for the budget itself. So just looking, I suppose, in addition to general macro performance, it's worth looking at the actual state of the budget, public debt and so forth. So Australia's public debt is currently, or Commonwealth public debt is currently around 16% of GDP. So what can we compare that to? Well, we could look at the desirable criteria for convergence to the euro back in the late 1990s. They suggested that you had to get under 60%. There was a bit of a fuss during the austerity period, and it was suggested that a level of 90% was the point at which danger ensued. Unfortunately, it was later found that there were some spreadsheet errors in the calculations, and that on correction, that there wasn't really much evidence even at this level of really substantial adverse effect. So a far more plausible conclusion, in fact, is that the Australian government is underusing its borrowing capacity. We have the capacity to borrow large amounts at very low costs, instead of which successive governments, and this government apparently intends to continue, have resorted to expensive so-called PPP arrangements, which both involve a higher cost of capital, but also large rake-offs to the promoters, most notably Macquarie Bank and so forth. So our debt position is not bad, and the forward estimates suggest that if nothing is done, debt will in fact stabilise and fall. Similarly, the budget balance, that's really the definition. The correct definition of budget balance is pretty much the point at which the debt to GDP ratio stabilises. Cash measures are slightly misleading, so effectively the budget is currently pretty much in balance. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no issues that need to be addressed. The government, and at least up until this point, the opposition has committed, the previous government and the current government, have committed to a bunch of long-term expenditure items, the NDIS, Gonski and so forth, which can be predicted to increase the demand for expenditure in the future. In addition, assuming that you regard the government's denunciation of Keynesian economics as the nonsense it is, you would like not to be in balance but to be somewhat in surplus under ordinary conditions. So we're currently kind of weak, so probably we're about the right point in fiscal terms, but it would be good to have a bit of a cushion in the future. And a problem which I'll come to, which has been exacerbated by the budget, although the Commonwealth position is actually pretty rosy, the states are chronically in trouble, and we've had a succession of unfunded mandates handed on to them. And that's been, of course, one of the very distinctive features of this budget, is a further increase in that process. So we would certainly, if we were designing a strategy for the next 10 years, we'd like to see some budget repair, or either increased revenue or finding areas of expenditure that we could cut back to the tune of perhaps 2 or 3% of GDP. That's nothing like a crisis, of course, and nothing like an emergency. And the hollowness of the government's rhetoric on the emergency is revealed by its own conduct. The moment it got into office, it started splashing cash about on things that benefited its own supporters. For example, although it displayed its toughness by letting the motor vehicle industry go to the wall, it was much more solicitous of the motor vehicle packaging industry, the salary packaging industry that provides tax concessions for motor vehicles. That had been cut back somewhat by the Rudd government. The hows of soon-to-be unemployed motor vehicle packagers were repeated with sympathy by the current affairs shows, and the government heard their pleas and restored something which is costing the public something like $1 billion over their forward estimates for the benefit of overseas car manufacturers. So we've seen, I guess, a bunch of measures of this kind: the abolition of the mining tax with no replacement in sight, the switch from a carbon price to a carbon subsidy, as they've attempted to make so-called direct action work. I'm speaking slightly out of turn as a member of the Climate Change Authority, but I think what we're going to see is something which looks very like, in the end, like a carbon price in reverse, that is, it will be exactly like a price, except that instead of the polluters paying, the public will pay them to pollute less. So these are expensive measures, and we've certainly seen this pattern continue in the budget. And I think it reflects, in important respects, a tension at the top of the government. That is, Tony Abbott is essentially really a man of three-word slogans. He really does want to axe the tax, stop the boats, etc. And he doesn't care at all about the market liberal reform agenda that's dominated Australian politics for 30 odd years. And so he's scattered through the budget all sorts of quite costly items which have appealed to Tony at some point or another and have been included. The parental leave scheme, I guess, being in some sense the poster child for this. It's hard, very much a personal priority of his. I'm actually more sympathetic than many to the idea that parental leave should be salary-based, provided by employers rather than a flat scheme. But nonetheless, it certainly sits very oddly with the general tenor of the age of entitlement being over and so forth. Joe Hockey, I don't think has much conviction on anything in particular, but he's inherited the job of Treasurer, and he's getting the same advice as every Treasurer has got for the past 30 odd years, that what you need to do now that the election is passed, you need to get in and make the tough decisions in the hope that in 3 years' time the public will have forgotten and rewards will ensue. I think, as I say, I think this has been the script for a long time. My friend and colleague Andrew Lee is coming out with a book on luck in politics, and he's making the point that election outcomes, which are actually very narrow, often are seen in retrospect as major endorsements. And indeed, that's an important point about the most recent election. Fairly clearly, it wasn't an overwhelming endorsement of the government's announced policies, let alone the unannounced priorities that they hold, but which they hadn't bothered to tell anybody. I mean, everybody who was paying attention knew about, but the idea that in some sense the people were voting as a mandate for stuff that the government, that the party sedulously avoided mentioning in the election campaign is kind of odd, but that's what an election victory does. So my point here is that in fact in 1998, hard though it is to remember, Kim Beazley actually won the two-party preferred vote, and had that election gone the other way, had the few seats fallen differently, the idea that the thing to do is make big cuts in the government and you'll be rewarded by the electorate might not look quite so appealing. But in retrospect, that's seen. Whether or not that's true, it's certainly true, I think, that this kind of logic has ceased to apply. Certainly my home state of Queensland, the Labor Party elected to about 5 years ago on a platform of continued public infrastructure and so forth, got in and suddenly discovered its own budget crisis, discovered it had to abandon its own policies and privatise public assets. It fell 15 points in the polls, and with admirably steely determination pursued the policy to its logical conclusion, which is that it now has 7 members in the state parliament and may be overtaken by some combination of Palmer and Catter as the official opposition. Its successors, I think, are having come in with a majority so large as to seem unassailable, look quite possibly as if they may go the same way. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the Queensland LNP government at least reduced to minority status at the forthcoming election. So I think the public essentially has seen through this stuff and is sick of being lied to. And of course, the fact that Abbott made such a play about this as opposition leader, I think, has made this kind of strategy even worse. But nonetheless, this is what Hockey, as Treasurer, is being told, and this is indeed what he has delivered in those parts of the budget that he controls. And so we see essentially, I suppose, the third element of the mix is the extreme tribalism that now dominates the entire political right. So they have a long enemies list and a friends list, and in essence, policy is judged in large measure by whether it hurts or helps the right sorts of people. And so we see, as I say, absurd generosity towards people like salary packages at the same time as the motor vehicle industry, which at least has this symbolic importance of having in the fairly distant past received a lot of tariff protection, is seen as something that's evil and needs to be punished. And so that's one of many such distinctions that we see. Add these things together and of course you get a fairly incoherent mix, which is what this budget is. So we get incredibly stringent cuts which have proved unpopular, combined with lavish luxury expenditure. And I think the two, as far as I can tell, depending on how you add these things up, the two biggest decisions in the budget are a massive cut in foreign aid, repudiating commitments made in Australia's behalf by the previous government, and massive expenditure on medical research. Of course, it might have been into malaria or HIV/AIDS or things which, in some sense, might have helped the people who just had their aid taken away. What is it? Well, it's cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's, all the things you can imagine Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott and me and quite a few people here worrying about. It's very much taking money from people like them and giving money to people like us. And the idea that we're in a drastic budget emergency, but we can afford to lay out billions of dollars on medical research. Billions, but still a tiny amount compared to what the Americans and other people are spending. So the idea that this money will produce a cure for cancer or something when hundreds of billions spent by the US over many decades has achieved only incremental progress is, of course, nonsense. But still, at a time of alleged emergency, it's something of an incongruous appearance. And we can run through the entire budget and see these kinds of measures. I think another striking feature is the heavy reliance on hypothecation and quite bizarre kinds of hypothecation. So, as all economists understand, money is fungible. It goes in a great big pot, and once it's gone in, you can't really tell where it came from. Occasionally, it's a useful fiction to say, well, this money is for this. The Medicare levy reminds us, in some sense, that we're paying tax for this stuff. It's a fiction. I mean, the Medicare levy doesn't, by any means, pay for Medicare. We need a lot more money than that to pay for it. But perhaps it does some good. Perhaps, having a fuel excise levy and saying we're going to spend the money on roads, there are some big problems with that, which I'm happy to come to in questions, but at least there's something there. But to say you have to pay $5 to visit, $7 to visit the doctor, and we're going to give $5 of it to cancer research is I think taking hypothecation to a level of bizarreness that I really haven't seen from an Australian government in recent years. Perhaps politically cleverer is the idea of tying a fairly small increase in the top marginal tax rate to the so-called deficit debt reduction levy, thereby apparently tricking Labor and the Greens into opposing it and ensuring that the 1% will get off scot-free in the budget. I'm still fulminating about that thing, and who knows, we may see some change perhaps, but I can't say I have been impressed by any of our political leaders on that particular topic. But certainly an odd, again, to take a standard revenue measure and take the default outcome of any additional revenue, which obviously is the budget deficit will be smaller and debt will be smaller, and call this a levy to reduce debt, I think is kind of bizarre. So what we have in the end is a budget which doesn't really, in terms of the big balances, it's hard to tell, taking everything the government's done, whether we've made any progress at all towards reducing the deficit. Oh, no, sorry, I forgot one thing I wanted to mention finally, which is the cost shifting back to the states, which I mentioned, go a step entirely in the wrong direction. To the extent that there's any alleged sense to this story, it's that the states are going to be blackmailed into coming forward and demanding an increase in the GST, which the Commonwealth will then reluctantly grant. Now, I think there's a pretty good case actually for increasing the rate of GST. It was introduced at a low level. Labor ran a fairly irresponsible scare campaign against it at the time. Introduced at a low level and then tied up in this way that all the states have to agree to an increase. But as a matter of fact, it's obvious that we're never going to get the states, all 6 of them, to come forward and ask for something which might not happen, take all the flak for it, and let the Commonwealth, of course, it's a Commonwealth tax, despite all the nonsense that the Howard government attempted to pursue, let the Commonwealth raise the tax, collect all the money, and then, of course, graciously decide how much of it the states might get. Possibly they'll announce they get the full 2.5%, but as I just mentioned, money is fungible. The 2.5% will go out with a great big bow around it, and the next budget will reef back 1 or 2% of that in the form of cuts to other programs. So I think if this government had any pretensions to leadership whatsoever on the tax side, it would be either announcing now that GST increases are off the table, that it's a low taxing government and doesn't want to do this, or saying, look, possibly wrapped up in the fiction of a state tax, but at least saying, yes, we think that this is needed, and if the states will agree, we will go ahead and introduce the necessary legislation. I think that's an egregious failure of leadership. And finally, of course, entirely, as you would expect, everything on the revenue side falls under this heading. We've seen no action at all on tax expenditures, even though they're universally recognised as the softest target in the budget. Costello, of course, greatly harmed the revenue with his decisions in the last couple of years in office. Labor spent 5 or 6 years clawing back little bits here and there, but clearly the Commission of Audit, which managed to recommend that the states should get income tax powers, nonetheless felt that tax expenditures were outside. They even managed to have recommendations on minimum wages, but somehow or other thought that the biggest, softest target in the entire federal budget was off limits thanks to its terms of reference. I think, certainly, I think all those who took part in the Commission of Audit, a couple of whom I had some respect for before, have completely forfeited that by this exercise. And I think the government has clearly failed to convince even members of the political class who you might expect to support it. The political class as a whole has not covered itself with glory in recent years, and I think the fact that somebody like Clive Palmer can be elected and re-elected, or his supporters can be elected not only once in a fit or peak, but elected again when we were told to have a rerun, is an indication of the dire trouble we are in politically, although, as I say, economically, we've managed to go through this reasonably well. So I think at this point I'll stop and we can have questions and discussion, short comments. Doesn't look like there are any LaRouchites in the audience, but yeah, short comments, questions.
Go ahead.
Jackie Fristacchi, I'm a Municipal Government Councillor and Mayor. One of the things that the Commission of Audit did comment on was trying to work through the fiscal imbalance we've got between the states, and you've identified that the budget goes in the wrong direction on that. Do you see any movements politically of that actually happening? I mean, I know that Greiner, and I know people, there are a lot of economists who've been working on it. There's a lot of people who are advocating for rectifying what Ross Gunner says, our dysfunctional financial arrangements, and I would, the Commission of Audit didn't include this, but local government is part of that, where our main source of finance is a regressive rate base, which is very difficult in terms of those on welfare or those on single incomes. So do you see anything in the political climate that might give optimism that we could achieve what was being worked on in, I think, in the 80s under Hawke, wanted to include local government, federal, state in a new fiscal arrangement for the Commonwealth? And if not, how do we work in that direction?
Well, I think there are really two ways we can go. One is for the Commonwealth to fully take over some really large area of state responsibility. Hospitals being the obvious candidate. Well, I mean, without wishing to say things, I think we've seen stuff ups at both levels, at all levels of government. I don't think, for example, that if we compare, for example, Medicare with the public hospital systems, I don't really see that it's obvious that the Commonwealth is. I don't believe the Commonwealth is obviously better, as many people in Canberra often do think, but I equally don't see the states as having covered themselves in glory in their own, and certainly not in the hospital sphere. So that would be one possibility. The other possibility is simply to accept that we're never going to achieve anything like fiscal balance, that we're not going to have any significant tax differentiation, and just accept that the Commonwealth raises the money. There's obvious problems with that. It tends to mean the Commonwealth's own purpose expenditure is going to get treated better than state and local government, and try and just live with that. Yeah.
Hello, John. Ian Morgan's interested citizen. Help us understand your worldview a bit better and therefore provide context for what you've said. You're running the budget. You can look back on the work you've done as Treasurer over, say, 5 years. What does success look like?
Okay, so, I suppose working within the realm of the possible, I guess I would say that we ought to have revenue and expenditure about 3% of GDP, 3 to 5% higher than they are at present. We really, I think, have been enthralled to a notion, a notion from the Liberal Reform era that if we only make room for the private sector, everything will be marvellous. Australia, of course, has gone pretty well, but I think I don't believe that we have discovered any magic recipe. We've been lucky and clever with macro policy. In general, we haven't seen the kind of benefits from these policies globally that we expect. So in my view, the case for example, low top marginal rates of taxation, the kinds of reforms that characterised the 1980s is much weaker now than it looked at the time. But within the realms of possibility, we're still talking moderate adjustments there. And I would look at most of that coming from upper income earners, from the top 1 to 20% of the population, who have been the big beneficiaries of growth. And within that, not all of what the Henry Review said about taxation was right, but a lot of it was get rid of a bunch of the bad taxes that we just mentioned, get most of the revenue from income tax, GST and land tax, and try and get rid of some of the more aggressive taxes that we just mentioned, and which the states also are still depending on, gambling tax, I guess, being perhaps the one which I personally get most upset about. But that would be, in the big picture, my story of success for the fiscal aggregates. And I guess I would say reforming things in terms of that's on the cash flow side, if you like, in terms of the balance sheet, trying to get proper accounts in which we look at debt, income generating public assets and non-income generating capital assets, get a sensible and coherent view in which we view, as we all do in our daily life, view debt as a tool. I mean, maybe, if Joe Hockey were my dad from the Depression, I could vaguely imagine this horror of debt, but I don't think, oh my God, I went to the bank and borrowed money, I must be a terrible evil person who is selling out my children's heritage. It's just the kind of nonsense we're hearing from the government on this really needs to be squelched. And so my other great achievement, if I were Treasurer, would be to get a sensible view of the government's balance sheet in which debt was viewed as a policy tool to be used wisely rather than some sort of morality blow.
Could you fill that out a bit more? Could you say what you think your priority for revenue gathering and expenditure would be with that
Sure.
3 or 5%?
The expenditure side, I think, is already pretty much there. A lot of it is anyway. That is, if we want to do the NDIS properly, if we want to do Gonski, we're going to have to spend more money if we want to stop the states. If we want to give the states and local government enough money to do their jobs properly, which they haven't been, they have been constrained for a very long time. I think the expenditure side is relatively straightforward. There's things like job start benefit that hasn't been increased for 20 years and so forth. So, but the amounts are still relatively modest in terms of the total. On the revenue side, I guess, as I said, obviously I would start with tax expenditures. Self-funded retirees get an incredibly good deal compared to working people on the same incomes. There are a bunch of other tax expenditures. The other one, I think, although that's the big money, the one I maybe feel most strongly about is the combination of concessional treatment of capital gains and negative gearing. I should say negative gearing gets an incredibly bad press, but actually it sounds terrible, but actually it's just tax deductibility of losses. There's no fundamental problem with it, except that those losses get turned into concessionally taxed capital gains, and the result is an epidemic of speculation, which, I mean, I look at the TV and I wonder maybe there's tax deductions for cooking, because all you ever see is cooking and home renovations. But certainly home renovations, I think, in Australia at least, will outlast cooking as a topic. And this is driven by the Howard government's decision in the 90s to cut the rate of tax of capital gains. About 6 months before the dot-com bubble crashed, with the claim that this policy would unleash a flurry of venture capital investing in new creative manufacturing industries and things of that kind. Of course, it went straight into housing speculation, as knowing Australians you would expect. So those two would be the biggest. As I say, I think we should have introduced GST at a higher rate. It's sort of, it's not my favourite tax, but it's one. It's a relatively efficient tax compared. We could replace a lot of really bad taxes with 2.5% of a 2.5% increase in the GST rate, more with 15, which would still keep us at low levels.
Ken.
Ken Davidson. John, look, I was pleased to hear you mention income tax is not a bad idea for increasing. Even people like Ken Henry, whom I have a lot of time for, has said that we have to roll back income tax. I was wondering if I've missed something in recent years in terms of theory or evidence that validates this proposition.
Okay, sure. So this gives me, I'll just tell my little joke, which I think no one will get. But so everybody goes on about gross domestic product, and there's only three things wrong with it. It's gross, it's domestic, and it's a product. What I mean by that is that GDP is a useful measure if you're trying to work out what's happening in the macro economy. If you're trying to work out, are we booming or busting, it's useful to look at. And so what the people who do this want is the most precise measure they can get. So we don't take into account depreciation on capital stock because that's hard to measure. We measure domestic income, that is everything that's produced in the economy, because again that's what we're looking at. We don't worry about the fact that some of that income is flowing overseas, the owners of foreign capital, and of course that Australians have money invested overseas. And finally, product, when we really, is a mistake for more conceptual reasons. We should be thinking about income and consumption as the object of economic activity. Producing is only a step on the way. Now, the relevance of this is that Henry, which, as I said, the report was generally good, we had a bunch of studies showing that lower capital taxes improve GDP. Well, of course they do. If you have lower taxes, you get more foreign capital in. That increases GDP, but it doesn't, up to a first approximation, make any change in net national income, which is what we should care about. The capital depreciates, and that adds to GDP. The returns go overseas, that adds to GDP. Unless there's some externality flowing to Australians, an increase in foreign investment is essentially neutral as far as Australian welfare goes. And so, this was just one of the few really big conceptual mistakes in Henry's report. I think the people to look at here are Piketty and Sayers, who I think correctly estimate that the optimal top marginal tax rate is around 70%. And I can go over that calculation. But no, that's something, unfortunately, that Henry got badly wrong.
Would you like to comment a bit more on Piketty's recommendation?
Sure. Well, okay, so the 70% basically takes the view that, as regards the Gina Reinhardts of the world, we should, roughly speaking, be neutral. That is, the welfare of the world is neither harmed nor enhanced if she gets another $1 million. Now, this is a view which some people will differ from in different directions, but that's certainly the view I take. I don't bear the 1% as a class any ill will. I don't wish them to suffer. Equally, I don't think that increasing their wealth is any social benefit. So, if you take that calculation, what you want to do is say, well, at what point are you as regards that group, at the top of the so-called Laffer curve? Not that Laffer, of course, invented that curve. That is, you tax them just up to the point where taxing any more would actually lead to a reduction in welfare for everybody else. And there's a pretty good estimate that that's around 70%. I think they allow they do a fancy utility thing, so there's a time little benefit for their additional consumption, which brings it down. down a bit, but that's roughly speaking the basis of that calculation.
It's worth just explaining who Piketty is.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And then,
Sorry, I'll briefly mention. So, Thomas Piketty, French economist, has been working for a long while in income distribution, particularly incomes at the very top. Really his work is was picked up by Stiglitz, coining the phrase of 1%, which then became a slogan for Occupy. His new book, Capital, something in the 21st century, I can't remember, I should know since I've read it, but top of the New York Times bestseller list, but also a very accessible read. Lots of references to Jane Austen and Balzac and stuff like that, and serious ones. I mean, seriously using their descriptions of society as a foreshadowing of what a future society dominated by inherited wealth would look like.
For those who haven't heard of Piketty before, there was a good article about him in The Age. Was it yesterday or today? Anyway, he's a French economist who's written this book, Capital, which is published by Harvard University Press, and it's sold more copies already. It's only been out for 2 months. Sold more copies already than Harvard Press has sold of any book ever before in the last 100 years. And it's regarded by some economists as the most important economic book of the decade, by others the most important economic book of the year. And it's about inequality. And lots of us are very concerned about inequality, and it's got some very important recommendations about the idea of taxing wealth, taxing inheritance, and much more progressive income taxes. Anyway, Liz.
Hi, Elizabeth Ozanne, Social Work Health Sciences, this university. Keating had a go the other night with the idea of his sort of version of long-term care insurance, which doesn't seem to have got a mention at all, even though it's been previously investigated by the Productivity Commission. And there are people around who've got some innovative ideas about how superannuation could be used in the funding of long-term care insurance. I was wondering what you think about that.
I try not to think about superannuation, I have to admit. So, I mean, I saw Keating's proposal, but didn't read it closely. I mean, I think I suppose the observation I would make is that when the Labor Party was busy expanding superannuation, we were still on a defined benefit model, which would largely have obviated this problem. And so of course, I think while Labor was still in government, they were also chipping away at defined benefit pensions in the public sector, while maybe being unfair there. So I think, I mean, in an important sense, I may have, unless I have misinterpreted the proposal, it really amounts to undoing what for a long time was seen as the major reform of retirement policy of the late 20th century. I think one which has proved to be retrograde and ineffective and costly. I think defined benefits, defined contribution pensions have already proved to be a failed policy.
It hasn't been given as much attention as it should have, I think, is the fact that we've only had 16 surplus budgets since Federation, of which 3 occurred during the 1930s, where there was an obsession with debt, but it's only recently re-emerged. Is there any economic rationale, or are we talking ideology, free market ideology and so on?
Oh, I mean, there's a long-term balanced budget rationale. It's just the question of whether the cash surplus is zero or is positive or negative isn't a very good proxy for that. So, having said we're in a great position as regards debt, we wouldn't be in a great position if debt was 200% of GDP, and so there's a limit to the extent to which you can use debt. It's a tool, as I've said. So the relevant measure isn't whether the cash number comes up as positive or negative, which is a surplus. It's whether debt is growing more or less rapidly than national income. And so, on that more correct measure, we're essentially in balance right now, and likely to be in surplus over the next few years. So I think it really just reflects the fact that the government's accounts aren't incredibly useful in economic terms, and all attempts to reform them for one reason or another failed.
Yeah.
Tony Keenan, I'm from Hanover Welfare Services. We work our missions on homelessness, and I really just want to ask your advice. What policy? We're having a spectacular failure, our sector, around raising the issue of affordable housing. When it's raised, it usually gets translated into first home buyer grants, and it's interpreted as people can't buy a house, when what we deal with is that people can't access shelter through the market, and the only market response is these dodgy suburban rooming houses. But the Commission of Audit, I saw, suggests that the Commonwealth should get out of housing altogether, and their only responsibility should be to pay rent assistance. That should then be paid to the states for public housing, providing public housing is rented at market rates. In this climate, what is the lever? Should we just, be mounting a campaign for more public housing?
Well, I guess, the success of my book with John suggests I'm not probably the person to ask about political strategy. I can tell you what an economist would recommend, which is that we should, both for the question of housing and affordability for new home buyers, but also for tenants, is that we should remove the land tax exemption for the family home. That's the policy that needs to be, unless we do that, this area of policy is never going to, unfortunately, is never going to be very successful. I guess I would rate my chances of being elected President of the Australian Republic about on par with getting that policy through, unfortunately. So I think we're going to, we're just going to continue to struggle, because that's really the only, until we remove that distortion, there really is very little that can be done to, other than going around the same set of hoops.
But short of a miracle, then what would you do?
Well, I guess I have to admit I look at this one and I think the only thing, therefore, I think regrettably there's very little I can. I'm sure studying it there will be some useful interventions.
Removing negative gearing.
Not nearly as good, because on the whole it encourages speculation in rental housing. So it probably actually, it's really owner-occupied land tax and owner-occupied housing is really the source of all evil here. I think the only thing we can do actually is address the problem at source. That if we didn't have so many poor and homeless people, we wouldn't have such a problem with housing. And so I think only by reversing some of the trends towards greater inequality and insecurity in the community as a whole, I think, I'm sorry to be so negative about it, and I'm sure there are useful initiatives that can be taken, but we have, I think, a total political block on the one thing that really needs to be done.
The land tax proposition is, Tony Dalton, RMIT, the land tax proposition is something that features in the Henry Tax Review. I also note that the ACT tax review has moved in that direction. I'm just wondering what your assessment is of the ACT developments and the prospects for that.
Well, of course, it may be relevant that the ACT is theoretically leasehold rather than freehold. I don't know. As I say, I've already characterised my own political judgment on these things, so I'd love to be shown to be wrong on this if something could be done. But I guess and the ACT is possibly a place where this might perhaps happen. I don't know.
There's one here and then one here.
I was asking, how is Australia doing in terms of private debt? And the reason I'm asking is particularly regard to the recent financial crisis. You have countries like Ireland, for example, that suddenly find lots of private debt put on the public. So it's not an irrelevant question.
Absolutely. No. So, and the answer is we've had a huge explosion in private debt, largely associated with housing speculation, I've said. And I think, as I say, I think although I think there was good management in terms of fiscal policy, there was also just good luck that the housing market held up for reasons. I think we could easily have had the same kind of crash as Ireland did. We have seen over the past 5 or 6 years both a return to positive household savings, so some stabilisation and reduction in the ratio of household debt to income, and until relatively recently a stabilisation, some real decline, I think, in house prices. Although that's, I think it's a major vulnerability, and I think the fact that essentially we just took the absence of a crisis here as evidence that our financial sector was perfectly regulated, even though an almost identical financial sector in the UK crashed and burned, is unfortunate, but perhaps we'll be lucky again. I don't know you, perhaps I suspect, being young and perhaps not an Australian, know the description of Australia as the lucky country, run by second-rate people who share its luck, is the full epigraph of that, and certainly I think never more true than at present.
Trevor.
Thanks, John. Trav McLeod from the Centre for Policy Development, where you are eminent fellow. I like your characterisation of us being in dire straits politically, not economically. And I just thought I'd ask 2 questions. The first is, what's the batting order on the revenue side? So to the extent that you would increase the GST or broaden it, change the balance of taxes on capital, consumption and labour, and look at those tax expenditures, what's the reform order? The second question is, you said it's a wish list. What's your take on what the response might look like tomorrow night?
Right, so tax expenditures number 1, easy, easy, everyone, lots of support for it. That's definitely number 1.
Can I ask you to explain tax expenditures?
I'm
not sure that everyone knows.
So tax expenditures means stuff that enables you to pay less tax, ranging from relatively simple stuff like charitable tax deductions to, most importantly, deductions for superannuation and concessional treatment of income earned in superannuation. That's in both, I think, in terms of least benefit for the loss to revenue, and in terms of political ease, that will be absolutely number 1. After that, I'm sort of, capital gains, I think, would be my next. Followed, if I didn't have to worry about the politics of it, by a restoration of some progressivity at the top of the income tax scale. I think marginal tax.
By capital gains, you mean taxing the full capital gains? Taxing
the full capital gains. I mean, if I were in the kind of land where I could tax the family home, I'd also tax them on accrual. But and then I guess 4th on the batting order of the significant stuff, the GST, and finally, I guess something which is sort of happening. Australia is theoretically leading the charge. Well, I've seen no evidence of this. International tax avoidance by the Googles and Apples of this world. There's certainly big money there, and I actually am reasonably optimistic that we'll see something on this, but I imagine that we'll have to wait for Turkey to lead the G20 before that organisation plays any real role in things. Well, I mean, okay, so this is interesting. I mean, and again, I'll preface this by noting my total lack of political judgment. Shorten's copped a lot of flack for saying nothing, but I think on the whole, up until today, that's probably been the right strategy. It's certainly a traditional script for a recently defeated government. I think this budget has been received so badly and has been seen as so poor that he has the choice of taking the soft option and attacking every promise that the government has broken. I fear that's likely, but he also, I think, has the opportunity to actually present himself as a leader with an alternative vision, and I think have the chance really to derail this government before it started. It would be great to see that. Not holding out great hopes, but it wouldn't be, given the low bar that's been set, it wouldn't be incredibly hard to actually say, well, here's a coherent budget that adds up and doesn't do all these terrible things.
Okay.
Right, I'm Jikon. I'm a lecturer in international relations here at this university. I wonder if you could speak a bit about corporate and business taxes and share us your view on that and how does that fit into this debate about revenue?
Sure. Well, I mean, that's what I just mentioned, of course, one aspect of it, which is it's transfer pricing by multinational corporations. I think that's that's probably the area, the area. And it's another area, I guess, where I think Henry, understandably in a sense, overstated the impossibility of addressing this problem. I think until recently, it appeared that international tax avoidance was essentially insoluble, that close one tax haven and you would immediately open another, but in fact the OECD has been remarkably successful. They introduced a blacklist, and to the surprise of some, there were no jurisdictions who were prepared to say, well, we don't care, you can call us blacklist if you want, we're just going to keep on doing what we did. Every single one of them put their foot on the slippery slope, and they only had to do something like sign 2 or 3 tax treaties, but next year the OECD came back and said, well, those were really great, now we want you to sign that tax treaty with everybody, and the next year they came back and said, and we want it to be automatic. And indeed, the Cayman Islands, and there was widespread expectation that Britain and France, having jumped up and down this, would protect their little bits like the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands and the Caymans and French, and they haven't. The Luxembourg and Austria have caved in. So there really is, at this point, for all but the very richest individuals, the idea of a tax haven is pretty much dead. Unless you have the resources to establish a network of shell companies among which to transfer your resources, that's become impossible. And I think the ultimate reductio ad absurdum put up by the people who said this couldn't be done is, well, of course, then there's Delaware, which is where these shell companies are most favourably done. No one will ever touch Delaware. Well, I think Delaware is suddenly finding itself sweating a lot more than they did. The recent Quebec election, which was a pretty appalling affair, one notable feature, though, was that a prominent figure was attacked simply on the basis that he had a large number of companies registered in Delaware, which proved he was a crook. He was a crook, and I'm not quite sure whether in this case the Delaware registration proved that, but I think certainly the idea that this can't be tackled, I think, has ceased to be true. There's only a finite number of jurisdictions in the world. None of them is out of reach in the end of a body like the OECD.
So there's still a lot to do, though. Because in the City of London and in Wall Street, if you have money there but you don't live there for longer than 6 months, you get major concessions.
Indeed, but no, I think the answer is governments are desperate for money and are less enthralled with the banks. I mean, they're still, of course, largely owned, but no longer body and soul. Merely half the body and most of the soul. Go on.
High frequency trading seems to be something that my name's Les Rosenblatt. The high frequency trading seems to be something that the big 4 banks and the banking system is quite happy about, and the financial markets indulge in at I believe considerable risk. What's your view on financial transactions taxes?
Well, funny you should ask that. I think John and I have been advocating financial transactions taxes for 20 odd years. So, and I think the high frequency trading, I think, of course, it's in some sense harmless. It only really harms medium frequency traders because, it doesn't do people like me whose superannuation turns over once every year very much harm. It harms the kind of people who are trying to play with sitting at home on their computers trying to do their day trading, and of course their orders are intercepted and cheated in various ways. So, but I think what it serves as, and Stiglitz has done this very well, serves as an illustration of the point that the financial sector is not providing a social return for the huge share of corporate profits it takes. It's failing badly in its core job of allocating capital while succeeding brilliantly in its job of enriching the participants.
Robert Dixon from Economics. You, I think, signalled in your talk that you'd be interested in elaborating on excise taxes on fuel. So I'd like to take you up on that.
I don't think I said in my talk, perhaps in another context.
But secondly, I noticed that you haven't said anything at all about mineral resource rent tax or other resource rent taxes, and I just wondered whether this was because you felt it was impossible to design a system that would raise sufficient revenue to justify their costs?
No, I mentioned, sorry, on them I did mention them briefly. I was just as an instance of the government throwing away revenue. I mean, I think we could have just kept the tax we had. Would obviously have raised substantial revenue, not as much as might have been hoped. We could go back over the whole story of the tax, but yeah, basically I support them and think we just probably. We could reasonably ask that a government announcing a financial emergency would not throw away such a low-cost source of revenue. Fuel exercise, again, we go back to Henry. In the ideal world, we'd have road pricing and carbon pricing. All the bits of the cost would be, all the bits of the total cost would be correctly priced and we do things right. Given that we're not going to do that, restoring indexation of fuel tax makes very good sense.
John Freeman, University. John, one of the big issues of the budget is a huge expenditure on infrastructure. And even further, there's an assertion that that's going to make GDP grow by 1% more or something. My understanding is that this is a list of projects that came out of some politician's head. There's almost no assessment as to whether we're spending the money properly or not. Do you think we really could have a decent infrastructure Australia that did a proper evaluation of what are good projects, what are not, and so on?
Well, I mean, I think my perception is that Infrastructure Australia hasn't done, the actual organisation hasn't done a really bad job. I mean, but I think there's a huge problem here, and I was sort of alluding to this with the balance sheet, is if we're talking about non-income generating infrastructure, it really has to be assessed. It means it's just capitalised expenditure instead of spending money. When we build a school, that's a capital expenditure, and then we pay the teachers. The idea that the school is infrastructure and therefore good, while the teachers are evil public servants, is just bizarre. So what we're seeing, I think, and you obviously alluded to this, is that because it's called infrastructure, it's subject to far less stringent assessment than current expenditure, even though it just adds up in exactly the same way as expenditure does. And so, I mean, I think if, for example, I look at, take for example, obviously a little bit of special pleading here, but if I compare, say, the road from Sydney to Melbourne with what it was 30 or 40 years ago, I observe that it's not only massively better in the sense of a better road, but even in terms of the traffic that's using it. It's far less congested and difficult to use than it was 40 years ago. If I look at what we're offering students in university education, much larger numbers, but they're in classes 2 or 3 times as large as they were 30 or 40 years ago. They get less hours of contact in general. In general, it's not at all obvious to me that Australia, I mean, I would love to have nicer roads, of course, wouldn't we all, but it's not at all obvious to me that the quality of our roads is a major impediment to the growth of GDP in Australia, whereas I'm confident that there are plenty of unmet opportunities in education from early childhood right up to higher education, and that those things are significantly affecting growth in GDP. So I think and I think it's fair to say both sides of politics, and to some extent, I haven't been as militant on this one as I should be, but I'm going to try and make up for that in the future and just make the point that infrastructure's fine, but the idea that it's some sort of cure-all, that infrastructure spending is some kind of special category that has magical properties, I think is something we need to kill off.
Alison McClelland. There seems to be a renewed debate about horizontal fiscal equalisation. And I was just wondering about your view about the obligation of the richer states to support the poorer states. It seems now that we have richer states that were supported when they were poorer, now unhappy about doing that. So would you like to comment on whether is it important? People are now questioning it, where it's something we've done for a long time.
I have to admit, although it's an important topic, it is one that makes my eyes glaze over. So I mean, I guess there's different. I mean, I suppose there's one specific thing which is minerals, which I suppose has become kind of I mean that. I think, especially given the history we're talking about, the idea that states that haven't had minerals should get any advantage from that, I think is pretty silly. I think my other problem, I guess, especially once we accept the reality that that the states are always going to be dependent on the Commonwealth, the question of whether equalisation between states makes any sense as opposed to equalisation between people, I suppose, is problematic. And it certainly strikes me, I suppose my pet hate here is the Northern Territory, which gets almost as much federal money per capita as the ACT does, even though the ACT is providing providing services to the rest of the country. That's essentially because, of course, there's a lot of poor people in the Northern Territory, most of them black. Very few of those black people, I imagine, spend much time in the Parliament House. You compare Darwin's Parliament House for a population of 50,000 with where the ACT Assembly meets, a converted public library, and you see exactly where you see horizontal fiscal equalisation at work. That Darwin is lavishly provided with services of all kinds, funded on the basis that there are many poor people in the Northern Territory, mostly living far from Darwin and living obvious living conditions of dire poverty.
Yep, someone up the back.
Nathan Shea. I was going to ask you about foreign aid, but I might ask you a different question instead. It seems that this budget has attempted to tackle the problem of youth unemployment in many ways, looking at changing New Start and changes to education and all that. I'm not convinced that that's the best way to go about it, but considering this is a global problem, not just a problem that Australia is facing, I guess what measures would you recommend for tackling youth unemployment, and I guess what is the rest of the world doing, and is it really the massive burden on the Australian economy that it's being portrayed as in this current budget?
Well, it's exceptionally generous assessment to suggest they're tackling the problem. I would have said they were kicking the victims, but well, I guess this is the kind of thing where I have to give the same answer as I did in housing. I mean, youth unemployment happens because unemployment happens, largely, broadly speaking. I mean, the way to deal with youth unemployment is to keep the rate of unemployment low, and indeed that's what we see in Australia. That the youth unemployment problem was massively worse for most of the 20th century than it is now. I mean, there's a bunch of issues in education policy. I think it's as the labour market's evolved, and to give the government marginal credit, although they're just taking over stuff from the previous government, I don't think we should any longer expect as a society to find full-time jobs for 16-year-olds. I don't think 16-year-olds have any business being in the labour force. As a general rule, I think there is essentially no career in the future that you can do with a Year 10 education, or for that matter with a sitting next to salary apprenticeship of the kind that John Howard was so nostalgic for, not of course for his kids, but for the kids who left school at Year 10. So I suppose I would say, in terms of the absolutely traditional view of youth unemployment is under 18, the answer is really we should be aiming at 100% school completion and nearly 100% participation in post-school education, so that the literal problem of youth unemployment would disappear in that sense. But we still have a problem that if the labour market is going badly, new entrants to the labour market are going to be among the most vulnerable groups. That was actually worse in the 70s when employers were more reluctant to sack people. The recession of the 70s hit youth incredibly hard at a time when much of the workforce was unaffected, but it's still a big problem. And I think the general answer is don't do things which will increase unemployment. I can't say on that score that this budget scores very highly.
Could you enlarge a bit on what else you would do about unemployment?
Well, I suppose I'll say I pretty much stick to the analysis that we put forward in Work for All, which is, and I suppose there's also another of my beefs about infrastructure, to some extent applicable to the previous Labor government, although their policies were generally very good. The way you generate jobs is by spending money on things that employ lots of people with the kind of skills that the population has. Now, 70 years ago, that probably meant saying we're going to build a road from here, and the paid workforce was men. We're going to hire lots of men, and they're going to come with picks and shovels and build that road. That's not how you build a road nowadays. You have a small number of people working with incredibly expensive capital equipment imported from overseas, and you build the road. The idea that road building is a sensible response to... it may, of course, be sensible in other respects, although we've already talked about that, but the idea that it's something you would do in response to an unemployment problem, I think, totally misconceived the nature of the labour force. We really need to expand precisely the kind of areas which have been cut in this budget and were cut to a significant extent in the last few budgets of the previous government.
In a situation where 75% of people work in the services sector,
and
human services.
It's the services sector that generates employment and will continue to do so in the future. And I think, again, nostalgia for a workforce of the 1950s, I think, is a very bad guide to policy.
Are there any more questions? I think we've had a very good innings. I don't think I've ever heard a speaker who's been able to reply to so many questions so succinctly as John has done. His mind goes a lot faster than perhaps not all of our minds go, but so I hope you've been able to absorb what he said. But what he said has been very wise and very well thought out as a result of a lifetime of thinking about these things. We're very grateful that you've been able to spend an extra night in Melbourne and give us this address. So thank you very much.
Thank you.